Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
Are you ready to manage your data more efficiently? You've come to the right place. This dynamic array functions and advanced Excel formulas training contains 3 sections. We start with some advanced formulas like index and match, then move on to dynamic array functions like unique and sequence, and then expand with new dynamic array functions. We've also made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free, so you can follow along. Just click on the link in the description and get your copy.
So welcome everyone, welcome to this month's webinar on advanced formulas in Excel. Now, just for those of you who might be new to our webinars, my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm a Microsoft trainer. I've been supporting and training Excel for over 25 years now, and as you can probably tell from the accent, I'm based in London in the United Kingdom. And I'm extremely happy to be your host for today because we have a very exciting topic to discuss: advanced formulas in Excel. And I always find with this type of webinar, it is a little bit more of a difficult one because what some people consider to be advanced, other people don't. So it's trying to pitch it at the right level so that we can account for everybody. And what I would say is if you are looking to become an advanced Excel user, really it has much more to do with being able to look at your spreadsheet, being able to look at a problem that you have and knowing which formulas you need or which combination of formulas you need in order to solve your problem or achieve your goal. And that type of knowledge really comes over time, but the basis is obviously knowing how each of the formulas work. So we're going to focus on some of the more advanced ones today and take a look at some of the different ways that we can use them. So this webinar is going to be pitched more towards people who already have an intermediate to advanced understanding of Excel. So what I mean by that is I'm not going to be going through a lot of the basics and explaining those basic concepts. So I'm sort of making an assumption that if you're joining this webinar, you're sort of already reasonably familiar with some of the more basic functions, the sum, count, all of that kind of stuff. Maybe you've used VLOOKUPs or index and match before. You understand the concept behind absolute cell referencing, things like that. So I am going to make that basic assumption because this is an advanced webinar and we want to get on to the advanced stuff. So just be aware of that. The other thing to point out is that some of the formulas I'm going to use today, and I've tried to keep these to a minimum, are some of the newer ones which are only available in Excel for Microsoft 365, which I think these days is what most people are using, and also the latest standalone version, so Excel 2021. The majority of things I'm going to cover are available in most of the versions which people use these days, so you shouldn't have too much of a problem. So with all that out of the way, the final thing, as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording, I think within the next couple of days. So if you find I'm going a bit too fast for you in this webinar, then use that recording, go through it at a slower pace along with the spreadsheet and work through it that way. It's always a good thing to do, I find, afterwards. All right, let's take a look at today's agenda. Now we're going to start out with good old VLOOKUPs. Everybody loves VLOOKUP. It's one of the most popular functions in Excel. And if you're already familiar with VLOOKUP, that's going to be great. I'm going to show you how you can use VLOOKUP in a couple of different ways. I'm going to show you how you can use wildcards in your VLOOKUPs and also how you can solve a common problem which I hear all the time. And that is when you're trying to look up something where you have duplicate lookup values. How can we get around that? How can we do that? So we're sort of going to extend our knowledge of VLOOKUP in the first section. I will start out showing you a very basic VLOOKUP just to make sure that we're all on the same level, but I'm not going to linger on that for too long. We're then going to go into just a little bit about just some really useful things in Excel, combining and splitting text. And I'm going to show you a few different methods. We're going to use some text functions. I'm also going to show you a couple of other things which don't necessarily fall under the bracket of formulas, but can be extremely useful as a replacement for formulas. We'll then move on to index and match. Again, lookup formulas. These are so important. I'm going to show you a basic index match, and then I'm going to show you how you can make that more advanced, how you can use index and match with multiple pieces of criteria. And we'll then move into two super important functions. And I say two, it's effectively four, because whilst we cover COUNTIFs and SUMIFs, I'm also going to show you COUNTIF, singular, and SUMIF as well. If you type into Google the most important functions to know, these two always come up. So it is important to know how these work. We're going to talk a little bit about logical statements, logical formulas, so things like if statements. And again, we're going to move it on a little bit. I'm going to show you how you can do things like nested if statements, and also how you can combine if with other logical functions like and or, and use multiple criteria effectively. And then the last part of this lesson, this is where we're going to move into some of the newer functions that are available in Excel. I'm going to start out by showing you the filter and the sort functions, because those are pretty cool. And then if your brains aren't fried at that point, then they probably will be when we take a look at this last one. And if any of you are really into Excel and you follow Excel, then you've probably heard about LAMBDA. It is a new function in Excel. I say new, in the last sort of 6 months or so. And this is probably one of the biggest game changers when it comes to working with Excel that there has been in the last few years. What LAMBDA allows you to do is basically create your own functions and formulas and use them throughout your workbook. So we're going to take a little look at that as well. Okay, so hopefully this sounds okay to you. And we're going to kick off with our VLOOKUPs. So let's come out of here and just bear with me while I transfer across to my spreadsheet, which I should have down here somewhere. There it is. All right, so we're going to start out on the VLOOKUP wildcards tab of the spreadsheet if you're following along. Now, I'm just using a very small data set for this first example. I just have a very small table. It's not actually a table. I haven't formatted it as a table as yet. It contains some serial numbers in column A. We then have product codes in column B, the product name in column C, and the price in column D. And this data is sort of very suitable for doing something like a VLOOKUP. So it might be that you have a serial number, and I'm just going to grab one from over here and stick it over here. Oh, my Excel has decided to crash. Oh no, there it is. And paste it over here. What it might be is that you have a serial code or something like this, and you want to find the product related to this specific serial code. So this is kind of the scenario where you would use something like a VLOOKUP. So I am just quickly going to recap a very basic VLOOKUP, and then we're going to sort of extend its capabilities. So if I want to find this in this table, what I can do is type in equals VLOOKUP. Now remember, with our formulas, we have our arguments underneath, and the one in bold is the one that we're focusing on now. So the first argument here is the lookup value. Now, when you're doing any kind of lookup, your lookup value is basically the information that you'll want to look up in the table. So for me, that is going to be this serial code that we have in cell F4. That's my lookup value. Press comma. I then need to tell Excel where I want to look up this serial code. So I want to look this up in this table. So my table array is the entire table, A3 to D11, comma. The next part of the VLOOKUP is we need to tell Excel, okay, once you've found this serial code in this table, which column of information do we want to return? Well, I'm looking for the product. So I need to tell Excel that I'm looking for the information in the product column of this table. Now, the way that VLOOKUP works that out is it basically numbers columns in a table from left to right, starting with the number 1. So the serial number column is going to be number 1, product code number 2, product number 3, so on and so forth. So if I want to return the product, that's going to be column number 3. And then the final argument on the end here is we just need to tell Excel if we want to exactly match that serial code in the table or if we want to approximately match it. Now in this scenario, I want to exactly match the serial code in the table. So my argument on the end is a false. Now remember, when it comes to true or false in Excel, you don't have to type false. You could type a 0, which also means false. If you wanted to do a true, that would be a 1. Okay, so that there is your very basic VLOOKUP. Let's hit enter and see what we get. We get door hinge. Now, is that correct? Well, yes, it is. If we look at our table, the product for that serial code is door hinge. Okay, so that is your very, very basic VLOOKUP. Really easy to put together. Let's take a look at a different scenario when it comes to using VLOOKUP. Now, what about, I'm just going to delete this out and also this. And what about if I want to do a lookup where I'm only using part of the serial number? So maybe instead of having the whole serial number written out in column F, I have just this second set of 4 characters. So for example, HYNH for the first one, or JNYH. So I'm not referencing the full serial number. I just want to look up that code in the middle. How can I do that? Well, let's take a look. If I type in the first one, so HYNH, maybe I have that there, and I want to return the product where that is part of the serial number. So that should be light bulb. Now, if I was just to do a regular VLOOKUP here, so if we just type in VLOOKUP, and I use this as the lookup value, and I'm looking that up in the table, this is basically what we did last time, I want to return the product, which is column number 3, and I want to do an exact match. Now, I'm going to put a false on the end there. It's not going to work because it's looking for exactly this in the table, and that effectively doesn't exist on its own. What about if we edit our formula, maybe on the end here, instead of a false, where we're doing an exact match of the lookup value, what about if I put a true on the end there for an approximate match? Let's see. Is that working? Well, not really. It's bringing back something that's further down. Now, notice that that also has HYNH, but it's not working in the way that I want it to work. So how can we do this? Well, one way that we can do it is we can use wildcards in our lookup. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by a wildcard, an example I would give would be if you were working in, let's say you were working in a Word document. And maybe somewhere in the text in your Word document, you had the words, let's say, United States and United Kingdom. And you wanted to find everything in the Word document that started with the word United, regardless of what was after it. So what you might probably do is search for something like United asterisk, which will pull back United States and United Kingdom. Now we apply that concept of using the asterisks to our formula. All right, so let me just clear what we have in here. And what we can basically do is we can construct our lookup value based off of our wildcard characters. So what I can do here is I can say equals VLOOKUP. My lookup value. Now, my lookup value needs to have essentially asterisks, HYNH asterisks, because I want it to find everything before and everything after as well. So how do we construct that within our VLOOKUP formula? Well, an asterisk is considered to be text, so it needs to go in quote marks. So what I could say here is quote mark, asterisk, quote mark, and then we want to join that. Now, the symbol for joining two pieces of text or strings together in Excel is the ampersand sign. So I want to join it with F4, and then ampersand again, and then we want asterisks afterwards. That is our lookup value. I'm looking it up in the table array, so we can select that, comma. I want to return the product that's associated with this serial code. So that is still going to be column number 3. And I want to do an exact match. So we have a false on the end there. Enter, and it's now going to return the correct one. If I change this to something else, if we put in QUTB, for example, we should find that that updates. Okay, so don't be afraid. When it comes to your lookup values, you can kind of combine things together, like use wildcards. You can even combine other pieces of text together to create a lookup value that you can then use in your lookup formula. Okay, so that is sort of how you can use wildcards when you're doing a lookup if you just want to find part of something in your table. All right, so that is your wildcard characters. Now, something we saw a little bit earlier is if we look at this table, notice that we have some duplicates in here, or we have one duplicate, I should say. So in the serial number column, we have serial number, and we have the same serial number right at the end just here. And this is something that I hear so often from different people. How do I do a lookup when I have duplicate values in my lookup field, essentially? And there are a couple of different methods that you can use to do this. One I very much prefer over the other, and we'll start out with the one that I prefer. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to get rid of that product just there. And I think what I'm going to do is let's just paste all of these serial numbers, Control C. I'm just going to put these over here. So what we can do here is if we have duplicates, or if our lookup value is going to be a duplicate, like it is for this first one, because we also have it further down, what we need to do is create our own unique identifier for each row in this table. So effectively create a unique ID so that the VLOOKUP can work. Now, if I do this, I would look at my data and maybe think about how I might create a unique identifier for each row in my table. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a column, and we're going to call this a helper column. I love my helper columns in Excel. And what we're going to do is, if I look at my data, I've got my serial number, and then in column C, I have what we call a product code. So even though we have the same serial number for the first row and the last row, they have different product codes. So what I could effectively do is combine or join together the serial number and the product code, and that is going to effectively give me a unique identifier for that row, because this bottom one is going to be different to this top one because they have different product codes. So again, what we can do here is we can just type in equals, and I'm going to say join this cell. We need a little ampersand symbol in there if we're going to join it with data in another cell. Join it together with the information in this cell. And that gives me a unique identifier. So now if I drag this down and just widen that out, I now have unique values, or a unique identifier for each row in this table. So now the question that people normally ask after that is, okay, well, that's fine. I've got my unique identifier, but I don't necessarily want to have the unique identifier listed over here. I want people to be able to select the actual serial code as opposed to this new amalgamated code that I've created. So how can we do a VLOOKUP where we're looking up the serial code, but it's effectively finding the unique value in this column? Well, again, this comes to how we're constructing our lookup value. So once again, if we type in VLOOKUP, our lookup value, well, I can tell Excel how I've created this helper column effectively. So my lookup value is this and this. That's my lookup value, comma. Where do I want to look up that string? Well, I want to include my helper column in the table array. So A3 to E11 this time. Column index number. Well, I've got an extra column in here now. So the column that I want to pull back is the product column, which is now column number 4. Do I want to do an exact match? Well, yes, I do. So let's do a 0, close the bracket and hit enter. Let's see if this works. If I double click to drag this down, yes, it does. So you can see that even though this and this are effectively the same serial code, it's pulling back the correct value in the table because we're using a unique identifier. Okay, so that is how you can handle VLOOKUPs if you have duplicate values as your lookup value. And of course, what you could then do if you wanted to tidy this up a little bit, you can right click and you can simply hide this column, tidy up your spreadsheet, make it look a little bit nicer. Okay, so that sort of solves a common problem. It's something which people talk to me about all the time. How do you do that when you have duplicates? So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Now, as we were going through that, we were talking a little bit about using that ampersand symbol to join different things together. And I thought at this point it might be a good opportunity just to move on to talking about text functions, where we can use the ampersand symbol to join things together, because these are things that you're commonly going to have to do when you're working in Excel. So let's just move on to our text functions tab. And again, I just have some very basic examples to illustrate these points. Now, fairly frequently, this will be something that you have to do quite a lot when you're in Excel. It might be that you've received a spreadsheet from a client, or maybe you've downloaded something from a third-party system. Your data comes across and maybe it doesn't look exactly as you want it to look. So you have to do a certain amount of tidying up. And quite often it might be that you have pieces of information in different columns that you want all in one column, or maybe you have information in one column that you want to break across more columns. So it's important to know the different methods you can use to do this, because it is such a common task. So let's take a look at how we do this using the ampersand symbol that we were just looking at in the previous example. So what I have here is basically just 3 columns, very small data sets. Here we have titles, we have people's first names and their last names. And my boss has said to me, I don't want these split across 3 columns. I want it to just say the full name in column D. So I'm like, okay, there's a few different methods that I can use here. Now, the first method is I can use that ampersand sign. So if I type in equals, all I need to do is say, okay, I want A4 ampersand, and if we want a space in between our words, we need to add that in as well. Now, a space is considered text, it's considered a character, so it needs to go inside quote marks, so quote, space, quote. We then have another ampersand symbol because we want to join that with the first name. Another ampersand symbol, we want another space in between the first name and last name, so quote, space, quote, ampersand, and then the last name. Okay, so we use those ampersands whenever we want to join things together. It might be a cell reference, it might be some text that we have within quote marks. Hit enter and we get exactly what we're looking for using a very simple formula. Now, another way that we can do this, the same thing essentially, is to use the concat function. And again, this is a function that I use all the time. So let's type it in. Now, notice when I type that in, underneath Excel's IntelliSense, where it tells you all of the functions available in Excel that are related to what you've typed in, we have concat and concatenate. Now, the bottom one, concatenate, has that little warning triangle over it. And that just basically means that that's kind of an older version of concat. Concat is the updated or the latest version. Now, if you're using a very old version of Excel, it might be that you only have concatenate. But I think these days, most of us should be using concat. Now, concat does the same thing, but we just need to specify the text. We don't actually have to put in any ampersands in order to do this. So text 1 is what we have in cell A4, comma. Text 2, we still need to specify the space. Quote marks, space, quote marks, comma. Then we have the text in B4, quote mark, space, quote mark, and then we have the text in C4. Close the bracket, hit enter, and we get exactly the same result. So both of those methods using those text functions enable us to very quickly join strings together, a really important thing to know how to do because it's something you'll encounter all the time, particularly if you work with a lot of data sets. Now that I've said that, let me show you the best way of doing this, which isn't a function at all. Now, we can use something called flash fill in order to help us do this very quickly. So if I just type in an example of the first one, so I want it to say Miss Deborah Ashby. Now I'm going to press Control Enter. If you don't know what Control Enter does, it basically leaves you in the cell instead of moving to the cell underneath. That's what happens when you just press enter. So Control Enter will keep you in the same cell. What I can then do is jump up to the Data tab, and in the Data Tools group, I have a Flash Fill button. If I click it, like magic, it fills down all of those names, so much quicker than using text functions. However, there is one caveat with Flash Fill. This only works if your data is all together. And what I mean by that is, if I just delete these out, if I wanted to put the full name over here in column E3, or in cell E3, I should say, and we have a blank column in between, it's not going to work. So if I type in the first one, oops, can't even type my own name, there we go, Control Enter, and then click Flash Fill, I'm going to get an error. And that's because it has to be right next to whatever it is that it's using to find the pattern. Okay, so if you have a situation like this, Flash Fill isn't going to work, and that is where you need to be able to have that knowledge of text functions to be able to do it instead. Okay, so just bear that in mind when you are joining text together. Now, the reverse of that is to split text up. And splitting text up, I would say, is probably slightly more complex than actually joining text together. So here we have the reverse situation. I have a full name column and I want to split this across different columns. Again, a very common scenario that you'll come across in Excel. Now, what I could do here is, if I want to extract the title from column A, I could think about maybe using text functions. And you may have used these before. Common ones are things like left, right, and mid. All three of those functions allow you to extract text from the left-hand side of a cell, from the middle of the cell, or from the right of a cell. So if I want to extract for this first one the word miss, I'd want to extract it from the left-hand side of the cell. So I'd use the left function. Now, I only have two arguments here. This feels straightforward at this stage. My first argument is text. So I just need to tell Excel the cell that contains the text I want to extract, so A12. And then I just tell Excel how many characters from the left-hand side of the cell do I want to extract. So if I want to extract the word miss, I'm going to say, okay, I want the first 4 characters. Close my bracket. I'm going to do a Control Enter. Now that's fine, but when I double click to copy this down, notice we have a problem. Because it's extracting 4 characters from each of these, and for where we have Mr., that doesn't quite work out correctly. So how can we do this? We can't just use left. Well, this is where we need to take a look at our names just here. And I might say, by looking at these names, well, I can see that I want to extract in each one of these everything before we have the first space. So what I can do is I can tell Excel to find the space and extract everything before. Okay, so where we have find text, I'm going to say, I want you to find a space. So again, in quote marks, space. I want you to find it within this cell. Close the bracket. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to tell me the position of that space. So for this first one, the space is in position 5. For the second one, it's in position 3, so on and so forth. Now that I have this information, I can utilize this in my left function to get the result that I want. So now if I type in left, I'm looking in this cell for my text. Number of characters. Well, if I say I want to extract the first 5 characters for this first one, that's going to extract the word miss, but it's also going to extract the space. Now, if you want to include the space, that's fine, but most of the time you don't. So what we can do here is just add a -1 on the end. It's going to -1 character. Close the bracket, hit enter, and we should find now when we copy that down, we get exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so that find command is really useful. You can use it with left, you can use it with mid, you can use it with right to extract or find things in a string and then extract from that point. Okay. Now, if I was doing this for real and I've got these just here, I'm probably going to want to move those across to the title column. And if I was to go in and delete these out, I'm going to get value errors because that formula is relying on those values in those cells. So let's Control Z to undo that. Now, the trick I always use here is I select these cells and I do a copy paste values to throw away the formulas. So it's just going to leave me with the text and no formulas underneath. So Control C. I'm going to go to Home, into Paste, and I'm going to say Paste the values only over the top. That gets rid of those underlying formulas, so I can now safely delete out my workings out, and I can just simply move these across. Okay, so text functions are really useful. I would recommend having a good read about those so that you understand how you can extract all different kinds of things from cells, no matter what the situation. Now, the second way that we can extract things from cells is we could use flash fill once again. So I'll show you it again. I'm going to show you a quicker way of using flash fill. So if I want to extract the first names, I'm going to type in the first one. I'm going to do Control Enter to stay in the same cell. What I can do is highlight the rest of the cells that I want to fill and press Control E to flash fill down. Okay, Control E is the keyboard shortcut for flash fill. Remember, that is only going to work if it's right next to the rest of your data. If it's in a completely different column, then you're going to need to use text functions. The final way, the old classic, the old favorite. This isn't, again, technically a function, but because this is so important, I want to make sure that you know text to columns. You may have used this before, but it is so quick and easy to separate text out. All we need to do is select our column of data, go up to the data ribbon, and then click on Text to Columns. Now, our data is delimited, and what that means is where we have different words in our cells, we have, in this case, we have a space separating each of these words. That's what we mean by delimited. Our words are separated by something. It might be a space, it might be a comma, it might be a tab. So my data is delimited, so that's fine. Let's click on Next. I then get to say what each of my words is separated with. So for me, it's separated with a space. And you'll see immediately in the data preview, it's showing me how it's going to split up that data. If I click on Next again, the only other thing I would do here is in the destination, I want my data to be split starting in cell B12. And when I click on Finish, it's going to split those across nicely for me. Okay, so I know flash fill and text to columns aren't technically formulas, but I just wanted to show you situations, what I would use. In general, I would use text to columns and flash fill as my primary way of doing this, but sometimes you can't use those, so it's good to have the backup knowledge of how to use text functions to do it as well. Okay, lovely. All right, let's move across to our next spreadsheet, looking up multiple pieces of criteria. Now, this is where we're going to talk about index and match. Again, another lookup formula. I know you're probably thinking to yourself, oh my God, so many lookup formulas. But honestly, these are some of the most commonly used formulas. It's really important that you know how to use them. And you can use them with other formulas in all different kinds of ways. And you can make them as simple or as complex as you like. Now, I'm going to show you, again, we are going to run through a very basic index and match, and just so that we're all on the same page, and then we're going to take it up a notch, and I'm going to show you how you can perform an index and match when you have multiple pieces of criteria. So we're taking it up to that advanced level. Now, we're going to start down here with this little table of data. Again, a very small table. We have a list of items, we have some colors for those items, and then we have the price. And maybe I have a little table over here and I want to look up the color in this table and I want it to return the item associated with this color. Now, if you're thinking, well, can't we use VLOOKUP for that? Well, VLOOKUP has many, I wouldn't say many limitations. It has one major limitation. And I'm going to highlight this to you now because this is a really important thing to add to your advanced knowledge. If you're looking at some data and you want to do a lookup, you need to be able to determine by looking at your data if you need to use a VLOOKUP or if you need to use index and match. Okay, so let me explain to you the difference and the disadvantage of using VLOOKUP. If I was to try and use a VLOOKUP here, so let's do that so you can see. If I try and do a VLOOKUP, lookup value, well, I'm looking up red. I want to look it up in this table, comma. What do I want to return? Well, I want to return the item. So again, using that principle in VLOOKUP of counting columns from left to right, the item column is column number 1. So I'm going to put that in. Do I want to do an exact match? Do I want to exactly match the color red in the table? Yes, I do. So we're going to say false on the end here. Now, is this going to work? No, it's not. Why doesn't this work? Well, it's to do with this column number just here, the column index number. When you're working with VLOOKUP, as I mentioned, VLOOKUP only counts columns from left to right, 1, 2, 3. Now, because the lookup value that I'm using, in this case, red, is in column number 2, and what I want to return is in column number 1, so effectively I'm going right to left, it won't work, okay? It can only go left to right. It can't look backwards. Your lookup value always has to be to the left of what you want to return if you want to use VLOOKUP. So in this scenario, to get the information that I want to get using a VLOOKUP, I can't do it. So that is where my VLOOKUP comes unstuck. So this is where index and match comes in. It's a much more powerful way of looking up information, particularly if you have complex tables of data where your lookup values and what you're looking up could be in any column. So I find that it's better to learn how to use index and match as opposed to VLOOKUP because it's a lot more applicable to more situations. Now, index and match, again, 2 words that tend to strike fear into the heart of anyone who works with Excel. And what we're going to do today is we're going to take all that fear away of index and match, and then we're going to pump it up a little and take it up to a more advanced level. Now, index and match in themselves are 2 separate formulas or functions. We have the index formula and we have the match formula. But you so often hear them used in combination. So you'll hear people say index match as if it's one formula. It's actually 2 different functions. So let's take a look at them separately so that you can see how they work when they're combined. So if we start out with index. Now with index, the first argument here is array. And the way to look at this is the array is always where your answer is contained. So I want to return the item. So my array is going to be this cell range just here. My answer is going to be in there. Okay, that is your array. Next argument is the row number. Now, the first thing I'm looking up here is red. So if I look at my table, because I have a very small table, I can see that red is in the first row. We're not counting the heading row. Red is in the first row. So I can say, okay, return row number 1. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to give me the correct answer. But I had to count down to find that row number. Now I have a very small data set here. It's very simple for me to count down, but imagine if you have a spreadsheet that contains hundreds or even thousands or maybe even millions of rows. Do you want to spend time counting down, finding the row number that you want? No, you don't. So somehow we need to automate in Excel how to find this row number. And that is where the match function comes in. So let's see match on its own. Now with match, we can say here, lookup value. I can say lookup red. I want you to look it up in this range just here. And I want you to exactly match the word red. Close the bracket, hit enter. It returns the row number that it finds. So this is pretty much what I need in that index formula, the automating of finding that row number. So this is why we combine them together. This is why they're so powerful. So again, if we go from the top, index, our array is where our answer is contained. So it's going to be A20 to A25. Now I'm going to want to drag this formula down. So I'm going to lock these cell references in place by pressing F4, comma, row number. I want to get match to find the row number. So we're going to go straight into match. Lookup value, going to be the color, F20. I want to look that up in this range of cells. Again, I'm going to drag this formula down, so I need to lock this cell range, F4. And I want to do an exact match. 0 on the end. Close off match, close off index, enter, and now I get my result. And I should find that if I double click, I can copy that down safely. So this is your basic index and match formula to perform a really flexible lookup. And in this, unlike VLOOKUP, it doesn't matter where or which column that lookup value is in this table. It can find anything. Okay, so really simple. I learned this by just practicing it loads and loads of times. So that's what I recommend you do. Just go over it until you can get that pattern in your head. But it really does help to understand what you're doing there, what the index function does and what the match function does. So when you can combine them together, you understand what you're doing. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a slightly more advanced version of index and match. Now, in the example we were just looking at, we basically were looking up one piece of criteria, and that was the color. I was looking for the color in this table, and I was returning the item that it was related to. Now, quite often you will have more than one piece of criteria that you need to look up, and that is this example that we have at the top. So what we have here is we have a list of travel companies, and we have a list of months running across the top. And what I want to basically do, and I've already set up data validation lists for both of these, is I want to be able to select a month, and I want to be able to select a travel company and have it return from the table what the sales figures were for that month for that company. Now, I have two pieces of criteria here. It needs to look up the travel company, and it also needs to look up the month. Okay, so we need to do an index and match, but we need to use two pieces of criteria. So how do we construct this? Well, let's go into our index. Again, the array. The array is where we're going to find our answer. Now, my answer, depending on what month I've selected and what travel company I've selected, my answer could be anywhere in this table of figures. So my array, my answer, is going to be found somewhere in this block, B4 to M11, comma. It's now asking for the row number. So what do I have in my rows? I've got my travel companies in my rows. So I'm going to do a match. And I'm going to match the travel company first of all, because that's in the row. Okay, so my lookup value is going to be what we have in cell A14. Where am I going to look up that information? Well, I'm going to look it up in this cell range just here, A4 to A11. And I want to exactly match the name of the travel company in that range. So I want a 0 on the end here. Close the bracket. That is our first match. We need to do another one because we need to look up by the year, by the month as well. So we're going to go into another match, comma on the end. Notice we've now moved across to the column number argument for the index formula. So the columns, this is the months. So now we can do a match. This time the lookup value is going to be the value that we have in cell B13, in this case June. We're going to look that up in this array up here, so all of the months, and we want to do an exact match. Close off match, close off index, hit enter, and we get our result. Excuse me. Let's just do a quick spot check to make sure that this is correct. So June, air to go, where are we? There it is, just there. And I should find that if I change these, everything is going to update nicely. So just take a look at that formula. We've just got two matches in there. Okay, so this is how you can do a lookup when you have multiple pieces of criteria. All right, so that is the more complex version of index and match. All right, quite a lot to take in. We've got quite a bit more to go, guys, so strap in. Let's move on to COUNTIFs and SUMIFs. Now, I'm not going to linger too long on this because I think I demonstrated this in a webinar maybe a couple of months ago. So I'm sure you can look this up online, but these are very, very important functions. So I might just demonstrate SUMIFs because COUNTIFs is pretty much exactly the same. If you know SUMIFs, you know how COUNTIFs works. And we are getting a bit pushed for time. Now, SUMIFs basically allows you to do what we call an if, we want to do a sum that has conditions. So for example, if we take a look at our table just here, we have some sales agents, we have the company that they work for, we have their job title and the total sales that they've generated. Now it might be that I want to work out the total of all of the sales for just Microworld. Okay, so I'm adding a condition in there, and that is that the company has to be Microworld before we sum the sales. Now, if we just have one piece of criteria, this is where we would use SUMIF, singular. Notice underneath, SUMIF and SUMIFs. One piece of criteria, we use SUMIF. We have three arguments just here: range, criteria, and SUMRange. Now, I sort of feel they've structured this a little bit backwards, because I like to say to myself, okay, what is my piece of criteria? Well, my criteria is that we're only summing if it's Microworld. So my criteria is Microworld. The range for that piece of criteria is this range just here, the company range, comma. My criteria is Microworld. What do I want to sum? Well, I want it to sum the sales for basically all of Microworld. Close the bracket, hit enter, and we get our answer. So you're doing a calculation, but based on a condition. Now we use SUMIFs if we have more than one piece of criteria. So if you take a look at the next example, I want to find the total sales for all sales reps at Microworld. So because we have more than one piece of criteria, for this we would use SUMIFs. Now this is structured slightly different. They're asking you for the SUMRange first, whereas in SUMIF, SUMRange comes last. So I actually find this a bit easier to understand. So the first thing you do is tell it what you want to sum. So I want to sum the total sales, and then we specify our criteria. Well, my first piece of criteria is Microworld, so the range that I'm going to find that in is the company range. My criteria is Microworld. It then moves on to criteria range 2. Well, the next thing I'm looking for is sales rep. So my criteria range is the job title range. And my criteria is sales rep. Now, again, I have these written out in cells. You could type in the text if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend hard coding things. I'd always try and use a cell reference wherever possible. But if you are in a situation where you have to, it's perfectly fine to type out the word sales rep. Close the bracket, hit enter. And there we have our result. Again, we'll just do the final one here. We've got three pieces of criteria. So again, we would use SUMIFs. Our SUMRange is going to be the total sales. Criteria range 1 is going to be the company. Our criteria is Microworld. Criteria range 2 is going to be the job title. And our criteria is sales rep. Now, criteria range 3, we only want to sum sales that are greater than 7,000. So our criteria range is going to be the total sales again. And we want to say greater than 7,000. Close the bracket, hit enter, and we get our answer. Okay, so that is SUMIF and SUMIFs. We have COUNTIFs and COUNTIF, and we also have average ifs and average if, but they work in a very similar way. If you can understand how SUMIFs are constructed, then you can pretty much do a COUNTIFs as well. And if I just show you, if we go to COUNTIF, it's very, very similar. If I wanted to count the number of employees at Computech, I would just select the range and criteria. So my criteria is Computech, my range is going to be the company, and there is my criteria. So very, very similar. So I'm going to leave you to have a practice with those in the spreadsheet in your own time. As I said, I'm very conscious that we only have 10 minutes left. I don't know where the time has gone. Let's move on to the next topic. Now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to fit absolutely everything in the next 10 minutes. So I'm just trying to think, what shall we do here? You know what? I'm going to jump across to filter and LAMBDA, because they are very new functions, and I think probably something that you've never seen before. And I think I've done ifs a few times previously. We can save ifs for another webinar. Let's jump across to filter and fit these in. Now again, filter is one of the newer functions in Excel. Now, if you're wondering if you have filter, an easy way to check is click in any cell in your copy of Excel, type in the word filter, and if you can see the arguments underneath, then you have access to that formula. You should have it if you're using Microsoft 365 and also the latest version of the standalone version, so Excel 2021. If you don't have it at the moment, I'm sorry about that, but you probably will have it very soon the next time your Excel gets updated. So it's always good to have a little head start knowledge on some of these new functions. Now, how do we use filter and why would we want to use filter? Well, if we take a look at our data table here, we have some students, we have the exams that they sat, we have the grade that they achieved, and we have the date. And notice that I have some little filters at the top here. So I think we're all fairly familiar with applying filters to tables so that we can filter for things like, I want to see everybody who sat the French exam. I can simply apply a filter. Very simple and straightforward. So why do we need to have filter in a function when we already have it here? Well, when I use filter in a table like this, I can only use it in this table. I can't essentially export my filtered list out to another part of my spreadsheet and use that. I also can't really combine it with any other formulas. And when I filter, it also hides rows. So if I have anything next to this, it's going to hide those rows, and that can sometimes cause problems. So there's a few reasons there why you might prefer to use a filter function. And it is pretty cool. So let me show you how it works. Now what I have in here in the middle here in column F is I have some filter criteria. So maybe I want to find out, first of all, or I want to create a filtered list of all of the students that sat the English exam. So what I can do here is I can type in equals filter. The first thing you need to specify here is the array. So that is the information that you want to return. Now, I'm interested in I want to see everybody who sat the English exam, but I want to see all of the information. I want to see the student name, the exam, the grade, and the date. So my array is going to be everything in this table. So I'm going to select the first row, Control, Shift, down arrow. So I want to select that entire table of data. That's my array. The next argument is include. So this is where you basically tell Excel what your filter is. So my filter is going to be that the exam must equal English. Okay, so I want to include, I need to select the exam column, again, Control, Shift, down arrow. This needs to equal what I have in cell F4. Close the bracket, hit enter. There I get my list of filtered results. And the cool thing about this is that because it is a function, I can combine it with other functions to make this even more complex. And we are going to do that in a moment. What about if I want to maybe apply two filters to this list? So maybe I want to see everybody who sat the, let's see, everybody who sat the maths exam, everybody who failed the maths exam. Let's say that. So two pieces of criteria. Well, let's delete this out. Let's type in equals filter. My array, well, it's going to be the same thing. I want to return all of this information, Control Shift down arrow, comma. What do I want to include? Now, if I have more than one piece of criteria, so I'm going to have two in this example, I need to put them inside brackets. So if I open a bracket, my first piece of criteria is the exam. So Control Shift down arrow to select the exam column. That needs to equal whatever we have in here. That's my first piece of criteria. I then need to type in an asterisk. Now, in this case, when we're using filter, an asterisk means and. So I'm saying return everybody who sat the maths exam and who failed that maths exam effectively. So my next piece of criteria, I need to put in brackets again. This time I'm looking for the grade. So let's select Control Shift down arrow to select that column. That needs to equal what we have in F12. Close the bracket. Now notice that I also have, if I press comma, I have another optional argument for filter. And that is if it doesn't find anything, so if nothing matches this filter criteria, what do we want it to say in the cell? You could leave it empty, but it's going to throw up an error and make your spreadsheet look messy. So I always like to put in something like no records if it can't find anything. That is it. Let's hit enter. And there we go. We get our filtered list using 2 pieces of criteria. And of course, I have these on a data validation dropdown, so I can then go in and my filter is going to update. What I could also do is, let me change this back to a slightly longer list. Let's go to fail. What I could do here is I could combine it with another function. So there is another new function in Excel called sort. So if I wanted to sort this list into alphabetical order by the student name, I'm going to go up to the formula bar and I'm going to say, okay, I want to filter, but I also want to sort it. The first argument for sort is array. Now that's basically the information we see here. That's going to be generated by this filter formula. So if we click right at the end and press comma, we then need to specify the sort index. So this is which column we want to sort by. So I want to sort by the student name. So that is column number 1, similar to VLOOKUP in that way, in numbers columns from left to right, comma. Do I want to sort in ascending or descending order? Well, I'm going to say ascending this time. I'm just going to put a 1 on the end there. Let's close it off, hit enter, and now I've got that list sorted as well. Okay, so a couple of newer functions there. Filter, have a little look at those. I would recommend really taking a look into filter because we used an asterisk here to say and when we're using 2 pieces of criteria. But you could use a plus to specify an or, and there's other little operators you can use in there to create different types of filters. I would highly recommend reading through the help pages available within Excel on filter if that looks like a formula that you might want to use. All right, guys, how long do we have left? Let's have about 4 minutes. Right, I'm going to try and cover lambdas in 4 minutes, even though this is probably the most complex one. But let's give it a go. And if you like this, we can do another one of these sessions where we can go through some of the other more advanced formulas. Now, as I mentioned, LAMBDA, one of the newest functions available in Excel, released in the last 6 months. There was a big fuss about it on LinkedIn, a big fuss about it with all the Excel people on YouTube, because it is such a game-changing formula. It allows you to create your own formulas. Now, I'm going to show you a very simple example because if you're not used to working with things like variables and parameters, you may find this a bit confusing, but we're going to do it simply. I'm going to go through it slowly. And when I say slowly, I'm going to try and squeeze it into 4 minutes so that you understand what you're doing, and then you can have a little practice and a play around with it. So what exactly is a lambda? Well, it's basically a formula which we can convert into a lambda, and then we can create a function based off of that lambda. Now, I can't explain it to you any clearer. The best way to look at this is to take a look at an example. So what I have here is I just have some very basic sales prices in here, just some random numbers. And what I want to do is I want to apply a 20% sales tax rate to these numbers. Now, if I was just doing this using formulas, there's a couple of ways I could do it. I could say equals, maybe do sales price multiplied by, and then because I don't have 20% written out in a column, I'm going to say 1 plus 20%. That is a way that we can work out price plus sales tax, and that's going to give us that total. Okay. Now, if we take a look at this formula, we have B8 multiplied by 1 plus 20. Now, what we can do with this is we can change this into a lambda. Okay. Now, bear with me. I'm going to delete this out. We're going to come to this first cell and we're going to type in equals a lambda. Now, the only argument we have here is parameter or calculation. And parameters are very similar to variables. And what you're basically doing when you're setting up a variable is you can assign just trying to think of the best way to explain this, you can assign a meaningful name to a number or a cell in a worksheet. You can even assign it to a range of cells. So in this context, if we're using that formula that we just did, B8 multiplied by 1 plus 20%, what I could say is I want to set up a parameter that refers to cell B8. Okay. Now, B8 contains my sales. So I'm going to put in here, or my price, I should say, my sales price. So I'm going to give cell B8 a name. price. I'm going to declare that parameter first of all, comma. I can set up another parameter. We're not going to at this stage, or I can do a calculation. So now I could do my calculation. So as I said before, we could do price, because that's going to be B8 multiplied by, and then I think it was 1 plus 20%. We did. Oops, I just need to close. Need to close off too. Okay, so I've set up price at the beginning, and I'm saying that that refers to B8. And then I'm using that in this calculation. So instead of B8, I'm using price, a meaningful name, and then I'm doing the rest of the calculation. Now, if I just hit enter here, I'm going to get a calc error because I haven't told Excel what price refers to. Currently, the calculation doesn't know that price refers to cell B8. So on the end of your lambda, you need to open a bracket and tell it that it refers to B8. Okay, so now when I hit enter, I should get exactly the same result. Now we've just done it for one of them just here. Now I could choose to declare another parameter. So if I take a look at my formula, I've got price multiplied by 1 plus 20%. So maybe I want to make 20% a parameter as well. So I'm going to come back to here where we have price, and I'm going to declare a second parameter or a second variable, and I'm just going to call it tax. I'm going to go straight to the end of the formula and tell Excel what tax refers to. So where I have B8, I'm then going to say, well, tax means 20%. I can then replace 20% in this formula with the word tax. Okay, enter, we should get the same result. So we've used a lambda to declare variables and then use those variables in a calculation. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, why would I want to do that? Well, this is how we can then take this information and create our own formula to use on comparable data. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that we want 20% every single time. I can use this formula if I want to work out what 10% is or what 40% is. So what we can now do is we can take our lambda, and I'm going to do this in the formula bar, and you don't need to copy all of the lambda. You don't need this last part where we tell Excel what these variables refer to. We only need the machine, the processing part, everything before. Control C to copy it. We then go to the formulas tab, and we're going to go into name manager and create a new name for our formula. So maybe I want to call this function name price plus tax, and I can paste formula into here. So now when I click on OK, check out what happens. I've created a function in Excel that's available throughout this workbook. So now if I type in equals, if I want to know what 20% of this is, I can use my new function. So if I start to type in price, can you see it's listed there along with all of the other functions in Excel? When I press tab, those variables I declared now become the arguments for my function. So I now just need to tell Excel what price I'm using. So I want to say cell B8 and what the tax rate is. And I don't have to use 20%. I could use 40, oh, not 440, 40%, for example. And now I get my result. And I can reuse that on other data that is comparable. So if you can sort of start to think, this is a very basic example, you can use this in so many different ways. You start to see how powerful this is to be able to create different formulas that you can use throughout your workbook. All right, let's begin, guys. You've got your file. Welcome, as I said. We are doing dynamic arrays today. All right, so the first thing I should point out when it comes to dynamic array formulas in Excel is that they're not available in all versions of Excel. So the ones that we're going to be focusing on today, they're available in Microsoft 365. So if you have Excel for Microsoft 365, you are fine. Excel 2019 and Excel 2021 only. So if you have Excel 2016 or older, you're not going to have these functions. Okay, so just a warning, if you don't have these, then this entire session is going to be about dynamic array functions in Excel. Now, when it comes to dynamic array functions, there's so many of them these days. Microsoft released about 8 of them, I think, a couple of years ago, and then they've literally just released in the last few months another 10. Now, the 10 that they've just released are only available in Microsoft 365, no other version currently. So I'm not focusing on those ones in this session simply because so few people have them. What we're going to do is we're going to focus mainly on the ones which were released a couple of years ago, and I'm going to show you some really practical examples as to why and how they're useful when you're doing things on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to discuss what are dynamic arrays in case you're not really sure, and then we're just going to go through many of these dynamic arrays. So we're going to take a look at unique, we're going to look at filter, sort and sort by, rand array. I'm going to talk to you about spill errors and sequence. And then right at the end, I am going to show you 3 of the brand new dynamic arrays that have just been released, because these 3 are awesome. So if you were ever thinking about upgrading to Microsoft 365, for me, these are a reason to do it, because these are amazing if you work in Excel. So we're going to take a look at all of these. So what are dynamic array formulas? Well, dynamic arrays are effectively resizable arrays that calculate automatically and return values into multiple cells based on a formula that's entered into a single cell. Now, that is a lot to get your head around without seeing an example. So let's open up our workbook. So this is where you need to open the workbook that I sent through to you. And I will open up mine. And we're working on the tab called Basic. Now, I have a very basic little table of data just here, just some fruits, the quantity and the price. So in general, if we want to work out what the total is here, we would do something like this. We would say equals, we might do quantity multiplied by price. That is what we call one formula, one cell, okay? And that is sort of the premise that Excel has always historically worked off of. If we want to copy this formula down, we can click or double click our autofill handle, or we can drag it down and it's going to copy that formula down. And that is always how Excel has traditionally worked. One cell, one formula. Now, what dynamic arrays allow us to do is perform multiple calculations in one go. So instead of typing the formula into each cell and copying it down, what I could do here is I could type in equals, I could select all of the quantity, so a cell range as opposed to a single cell, multiplied by this range just here. Now, previously in older versions of Excel, in order to get this to calculate correctly, we used to have to press Control-Shift-Enter. It was always called the CSE method, and it's how dynamic array formulas were calculated. But in the newer versions of Excel, the later versions, we don't need to press Control-Shift-Enter anymore. We can simply press Enter, and it's going to essentially perform that calculation, but it's going to spill the results down the rest of the cells. So this is the behavior. It's called spilling, where we enter in a formula in one cell, and it spills the results out into other cells. That is basically a dynamic array formula. And one thing that you'll note about these dynamic array formulas is if you take a look in the formula bar where we have our formula calculation, if we click in the cell underneath, notice that it's grayed out in the formula bar. And this is another sort of property or behavior of dynamic arrays, in that they can only be edited in the cell you originally typed them into. Okay, and this whole behavior is called spilling. And we're going to talk more about spilling a bit later on. But that is just to give you a basic understanding of what a dynamic array is if you weren't sure. So now we have that in our mind and we sort of have a bit of an idea as to what they do. Let's take a look at dynamic arrays in action, because some of these things I'm going to show you are so useful. So we're going to start out with one of my favorites, and that is the unique function. Honestly, when this was released, I was like, oh, I can't believe it. This is the function that I've been looking for my entire life. What this will allow us to do is it will allow us to extract a unique list from a range of cells. So effectively, it's almost like it removes duplicates from a list, and it is so simple to use. So you can see here, I have another table of data. So let's just say that this is for invoices. Okay, we have an invoice number column, we have a date column, we have a client column, amount, and status. Now, maybe over here in columns I and J, I simply want a list of all of the clients, and then I want to maybe work out their total using a SUMIFs formula. Now, if you take a look at my table over here, you can see that my clients repeat. Okay, so they're not individuals. I have Facebook a number of times here. I have Gramson, I have Gaggle, I have Oracled. So I have duplicates of the client names. Now over here, I just want a unique list. So this is where we can use unique. And it is so simple. We simply select the array, which is just another name for a range of cells, close the bracket, hit enter, and it's basically going to remove those duplicates and just give us a list of all of those unique clients. And then, of course, once we have this list, we can then do whatever calculation we need based off of this list. So maybe I want to find out how much each client has paid. Okay, so I want to sum the amount column for each client. So that is where I would use a SUMIFs. SUMIFs isn't a dynamic array formula, but while we're here, we might as well do it. SUMIFs will allow me to sum whatever I specify. So I want to sum the amounts, and we're going to lock those cells when the criteria is equal to Facebook. So where are we going to find the criteria? We're going to find it over here. That's our criteria range, and our criteria is Facebook. And I need to lock this if I want to copy it down by pressing F4. Close the bracket, and then I can copy that down. So that's a really nice practical way of how you can use unique to extract a unique list from a table and then utilize it with other formulas like SUMIFs to get your totals. Okay, so unique is an absolutely amazing formula. Now, one thing that you'll find here when you're using unique, if I was to add more invoices to the bottom here, so let's just copy this bottom one and let's just paste it down here. And I'm just going to change the client name to something else. Let's go for Snapple. Notice that the clients don't update over here. It doesn't add Snapple on the end here. Now, I can get that to add it automatically because in general, it's always good to make everything that we're doing dynamic. I can get it to add automatically by putting my data set into a table. So I'm going to delete out the unique function and let's get rid of these SUMIFs as well. And let's put our data into a table this time. So Control T. Yes, my table has headers. Let's click on OK. And that is very horrible formatting. So let's go to table styles and I'm just going to switch it to none. Now, remember with tables, if you're not used to using tables, tables are one of the best things you can ever use in Excel because they have this auto expand capability. So anytime you add anything onto the bottom of a table, it will automatically update anything that's using that table data. Now, I'm going to name my table. If we go up to the table design ribbon, over in the first group here, can you see it says table 1? So we have a default table name. I'm going to change this to invoices and hit enter. So now if I'm using unique over here, what I can do is say unique, and then I can use the column like that. I can just select it. So you can see now, instead of cell references, we get table references. So it's telling me that I'm using the invoices table and I've selected the client column. When I close it, we get exactly the same result, and that is we get a list of clients. But this time, if I was to add another invoice on the end here, so let's do Control C, Control V, and I'm going to change this to Snapple again. Whoops. S-N-A-P-P-L-E. There we go. Can you see that it automatically updates? Okay, so just bear that in mind. Putting things in a table and combining that with dynamic arrays is a really powerful way of making your entire worksheet really dynamic and easy to update. Okay, so that is unique. Now, another way that I love to use unique is I use unique all the time when I'm creating data validation drop-down lists. And we're actually going to use it again as we talk through our second example. We're now working on the filter and sort worksheets. So filter and sort, let's deal with filter first of all, because this is another really popular dynamic array function and people really love this function. And some people don't really get why we use it because people say, well, you know, we already have many ways of filtering data in Excel, which is true. Again, we have our same data set, our invoices, and the traditional way to filter this data set would be to essentially just add some filters at the top here, those little drop down arrows. So if we go to the data tab, we can turn on filters and we get our little drop downs. So if I click the drop down here, I can choose what I want to filter by. I'm sure we all know how to use this. It's going to filter the list below. So why do we need a function specifically related to filtering? Well, there are a couple of drawbacks of using this little drop down method. The first one being you can only filter your data in place. So I can only filter my data in this specific range of cells in this table. I can't select a filter from here and have it output the results over here. Okay, so we're very much restricted to where our filtered results are going to be. And also we can't combine it with formulas to make the filtering more powerful. So that is essentially what the filter formula allows us to do. We can output the results of the filter anywhere to any cells, and we can also combine it with other formulas and functions to make it even more powerful. And one way that I see people combining other formulas with filter a lot is by using sort. So people will filter their data and then they will sort it using the new sort dynamic array function. And that's pretty much what we're going to do here, but we're also going to use unique. So we're going to, or what we're aiming to do here is I want to be able to choose a client from a drop-down menu in cell J4. So we're going to build a little data validation list based off of the clients that we have in here. And I want to be able to select a client from this drop down and then have it produce down here just the invoices. So it's effectively applying a filter based on whatever we've selected in the data validation up here. So the first step of this is building our data validation list, and we want to make sure that we have unique values in our data validation. So again, this is another way that I love to use the unique formula to work with data validation. So somewhere over here, it doesn't matter where, just in a random column, I'm going to, again, get a unique list of all of the clients. Now, you could put this into a table, again, to make everything completely unique. I'm not going to at this stage. We're just going to select these and hit enter. So we have our little list of unique clients over here. And if you take a look in the formula bar, there is our unique formula. Now, I could also use the sort dynamic array formula to sort my unique list alphabetically. So while we're here, let's do that. I can add sort onto the beginning. So this is another dynamic array function. You can see the arguments underneath. The first argument is the array. Now, if I click on this, it's going to highlight the unique function. So our array is basically being generated by the unique function. So we just need to go on to the end here, comma, and provide the sort index. So this is where we can choose what we want to sort by, or if we want to sort descending, ascending, things like that. Now, you don't have to add anything onto the end here. You can just simply close the bracket and it will sort them. The default is to sort them A to Z. So you don't have to actually add anything onto the end if that's what you want to do. So now I have these sorted. So now I have this, I can build my data validation dropdown. So let's click in cell J4. We're going to go up to data, and then in the data tools group, we're going to choose data validation. And if you've never used this before, the most popular one, there's lots of different types of data validation that you can do in here, but by far the most popular is to create a drop-down list in a cell. So we're going to choose list, and then we just need to provide our source. So my source is going to be my unique list of clients that I have in column O. Now I could go in and I could select the entire range like that, but with dynamic arrays, you don't actually even have to do that. All you need to do is select the first one and add the hash symbol on the end. Okay, that hash symbol basically means the spill range. So it will pick up everything within that spill range. Remember, that's the terminology we use when we're working with dynamic arrays. So if I click on OK, I now get a little drop down and there is my list of clients. So that's another way that you can use unique. We've seen how we can use sort to sort that list, and we've built out our data validation drop down. So now that we have this, we need to use this to filter our table of results based on what we've selected in the data validation list. So this is where we can use the filter function. Now, it's worth noting here that I'm going to be returning all of the columns from this table. So I want to return invoice number, date, client amount, and status. You don't have to return all of the columns. It might be that you only want to return the invoice number, the date, and the client. That's absolutely fine. And I'll show you where you specify this. So if we type in filter first of all, the first argument is the array. So this is where you specify what columns you want to return. So I want to return everything, so I'm going to select everything. But if you only wanted to return 3 of the columns, you would just need to select 3 of them, okay? So you specify your array. So let's go for this just here, B5 to F24, comma, and then you specify what you want to include. Okay, so we want to include when the client equals whatever we have in cell J4. So I want to include when this column is equal to what we have up here. Okay. Now, the last argument of filter is an optional argument. It's in square brackets, which means it's not mandatory. We could end our formula now, but let's add this in. What this says is, if it doesn't find any results, what do you want it to say? So I'm just going to put in quote marks. If it can't find anything or nothing matches, we're just going to have no invoices in there. Let's close the bracket and hit enter, and you can see the results are being returned for Gramzon. If I change this to Facebook, I'm getting those results. Okay, so this works really, really well. Now, again, with these dynamic array formulas, notice if I click in this cell, I can go up to the formula bar and I can edit the filter. If I click in one of these other cells, I can't. It's grayed out. So now that we have this very basic filter, you can also filter on multiple criteria. So we just specified one piece of criteria here. Our criteria was simply that we filter for this particular client. So one piece of criteria. Now, maybe I want to filter on 2 pieces of criteria. Maybe I want to filter for all clients that match what we've selected in the data validation dropdown, but only clients that have a status of, let's say, paid. Okay, so we have 2 pieces of criteria. How are we going to set up our filter? Well, let's delete it out and start again. We're going to go for filter one more time. Our array, again, I want to return everything, so we're going to select everything. Then when it comes to what we want to include, if you have more than one piece of criteria, you need to put it in brackets. So we're going to open a bracket, and the first thing we want to include is basically what we included last time. So we want to say when the client is equal to what we have in cell J4. That's our first piece of criteria. We close the bracket. We then need to do multiply in here, or asterisk. And what this asterisk means is basically and, okay? And then we have our second piece of criteria. So I want it to filter for all clients that are equal to oracled in this example, and when they have a status of paid. So our second piece of criteria is going to be when this column is equal to, and we're just going to say paid. And close the bracket. Again, if we want to add in that optional last argument, we can add in no invoices on the end there. Okay, enter, And you can see that's exactly what we get. Let's make sure it's working for other ones. There you go. There's an example of that third or that optional argument in action. It hasn't found any invoices for Gramson with a status of paid. And so we're getting no invoices. If we select Oracled, we have a few in there. Okay, so this filter formula is really, really useful. Now, you could carry on adding different pieces of criteria. Again, if you cast your eyes up into the formula bar, if I wanted to add a third piece of criteria, I would just repeat this pattern. I would click at the end here. I would do another asterisk, meaning and then put my third piece of criteria in closed brackets. So you can really expand on this and really customize it however you like. Now, it's also worth noting with this filter formula, you can change the little operator that you're using. So instead of doing an and, I could change the asterisk to a plus, and we're effectively doing an or there. So you can see that the results have now completely changed because it's now looking for where clients are equal to oracled or if the status is paid. Okay, so if you can see one with not paid in there, that's going to be oracled because it's going to include both. All right. And there are other things apart from asterisks and plus that you can use in your filter formula to get it to do different things. And I would highly recommend that you do jump online and take a look at the different operators that you can use with filter because it can get really, really interesting. And of course, with this, we can then combine it with the sort dynamic array if we want to sort our results. So maybe I want to sort these by date. I can go up to my filter formula in the formula bar. I can add sort onto the beginning. My array is being generated by the filter formula. So if we click at the end here, I can then choose my sort index. Now, a sort index is basically the column number that you want to sort by. So if I wanted to sort my results by the date column, that is column number 2 in the table. So my sort index here would be 2. I could close it, hit enter, and it's going to sort them by that date column. Again, if I don't specify ascending or descending, it's going to do ascending by default. All right, so that is how you can combine all of these different formulas together. And just on a side note, we also have sort by. Now, I would definitely say that sort by I use a lot less than I use sort. Sort by is very similar to sort, except instead of sorting on a range of cells like sort does, sort by sorts a range of cells by another range or array. Okay. So it does work in a little bit of a different way. So I'll show you a very quick example. I'm not going to linger too long on this because most of the time you're probably going to use sort. But we do have sort by in here. And we can choose the array, again, what we want to return. I want to return all of the columns, so I can select everything just here. I've got this in a table, which is why it's saying table 3. And then instead of providing a sort index number like we did last time, which is a column number, 1, 2, 3, 4, this time we choose an array that we want to sort by. So maybe I want to sort by, what should we sort by? Let's go for clients, why not? I would select this array, and then I can choose the sort order, ascending or descending. So let's do -1 for descending. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's basically going to sort that information as I've specified. Okay, so there's a very small difference between sort and sort by. One uses an index number, one uses an array to sort by. So we've moved through quite a few of these. Let's move on to some of the ones which I think are quite fun. So we're going to move on to rand array. Now, rand array, again, this is one of the newer dynamic functions. This will allow you to generate a array of random numbers, as it might suggest by the name. Now, why would this be useful to you? Why would you need random numbers in a cell, in cells? Well, I have to say that for me and the type of work that I do, I use RandArray all the time because I'm constantly generating data sets and practice files for sessions like we're in now. And I need to have sample data. So a lot of the time, if I just want to get some random numbers into a spreadsheet so that I can use them in a webinar as an example, I will use the RandArray function. So this might be something that you find useful if you want to generate your own dummy data. So let me just show you how it works. It is so simple. You can see here I've got a little table. We have months, January to December, and we've just put Q1 to Q4. And maybe I just want to fill all of these cells in the middle with some randomly generated numbers. Or we can use RandArray to do this. You can see here we've got quite a few arguments. They are all optional, which is slightly weird, but they are all optional. We're going to use all of them. The first thing is we need to specify the number of rows. So how many rows of random numbers do we want? Now, in this case, because I want a small amount of rows, I only want January to December, I know that the number of rows I want is 12. I'm going to show you in a moment how you can do this if you have a very, very if you have a large amount of rows, a much quicker way of doing this instead of counting them all. But for the time being, we're just going to say 12 rows. We then specify how many columns of random numbers we want generated. So I have Q1 to Q4, so that's 4 columns. And then you can specify a minimum value and a maximum value. And RandArray will generate random numbers between those two values. So let's just say 100 is our minimum and 200 is our maximum. And the final argument is if you want these numbers as a decimal or if you want them as an integer. So let's use true on the end here and generate some integers. Close the bracket, hit enter, and you can see what happens here. Now, I already had currency formatting applied to this range of cells. Ordinarily, yours would look like that once you'd finished the array formula. But once you have these in here, you can very simply apply your formatting, and in a very quick amount of time, you've managed to generate a whole bunch of numbers. Okay, so it can be really useful if you're trying to practice formulas and things like that. Now, let me show you one more example of RandArray where we have a very large amount of rows and we don't necessarily want to count down them all. We can combine RandArray with COUNT-A. So what we could do here is we can get Excel to count the rows for us. So instead of rows, instead of typing in 12 or whatnot, we could say COUNT-A, and then we would just need to highlight the column or the range. I can do this very quickly, Control Shift down arrow, and that will basically count the number of rows for us. And I could do the same with the columns. So I could say COUNT-A again, and I want it to count the number of columns, and then we're back into our argument. So let's say minimum value 100, maximum 200, and this time we'll go for decimals. Let's go for decimals, close the bracket, hit enter, and again, it's going to generate. If I don't have formatting applied, it would be decimals in here. Okay, so that is how you can combine RandArray with COUNT-A if you have a large data set and you don't want to count down different rows. Now, another thing to notice with this particular function is this is what we call a volatile function. Now, if I start clicking around and doing things, so if I double click up here to resize the columns, can you see as I do that, the numbers in the table are changing constantly? And this is what a volatile function does. It constantly refreshes when you start clicking around. Now, it might be that you're fine with that, but a lot of the time, if I've done this, if I was going to use this working data set here and start to do some calculations or maybe create charts, I don't want this data or these numbers changing every single time I'm clicking around and doing something. So this is where once I've done this, I would then select everything in here. I would say Control C, and then I would choose to paste the values only. Okay, so what that will do is it will throw away the RandArray formula underneath, and now these numbers aren't going to change when we're doing different things. Okay, so just be aware of that. It's a volatile function that changes. Now, another thing you need to be made aware of is if we delete out all of this, is spill errors. Now, as we know with these dynamic array functions, the results spill across or spill down different cells. And you will occasionally maybe get a spill error. Now, the most common reason for a spill error is the fact that it doesn't have enough room to spill across different cells. So if I had something in here, I'm just going to say hello. If I had something already in here and then I was trying to use rand array, so let's just quickly say 12, 4, we'll go for 1 and 10. Let's just do that. I'm getting a spill error. Okay. If I click on the triangle, it basically tells me spill range isn't blank. So it knows that it needs to spill this formula down 12 rows, but it can't because there's already something there. Okay, so be aware of that because that's something that comes up pretty often when you're working with dynamic arrays. Lovely. Let's do a quick time check. We're doing pretty good for time. Let's move on to sequence. Now, sequence is another one of those little functions that can be really useful in your day-to-day work. And all it does is it basically generates a list of sequential numbers. So how can we use this in a helpful way? Well, let me show you an example. Maybe here I want to list out, maybe I'm listing out some participants in a race, let's say. And I want to have participant number 1, and then I want the participant, we're going to say Tom Bruce, and then I want participant number 2, so I need to go back over here, number 2, and we've got Emma Stone, and then I need to go to the next one. And it's a little bit tedious, but it's not too much of a problem. But we could use sequence to help us out with this and really kind of get this to automate itself so that the numbers are automatically input as we add the names. So sequence in itself, let's take a look at the arguments. So sequence will generate a sequential list of numbers. So let's just take a look at it in its most basic form first of all. So again, we can specify the number of rows that we want. So let's say we want 10 rows. I'm going to say 1 column. I want to start at number 1 and I want to step up by 1. That's what we're going to get. So let's take a look at it. We have our 10 rows. We have 1 column. We start at number 1 and the step value is 1. So it just goes up by 1 each time. We could modify this and I could say step value is 10 as opposed to 1. And it's going to go 1, 11, 21, so on and so forth. You could say that you want 20 rows instead. Or maybe you want to start at a completely different value. So maybe you don't want to start at 1. Maybe you want to start at 10 and go up by 10. All right. So there's lots of different ways that you can use sequence to generate lists of numbers. So how can this be useful for us if we want it to automatically generate numbers as we type names into a column? Well, again, what we can do with sequence is we can cleverly combine it with count A. We can combine it with count A. We can select column C, which is where I'm going to type in the participant names, close off 2 brackets. And then what happens is when I enter name and hit enter, it automatically adds the next number. Okay, pretty cool. Now, one thing you can do to make this even better is notice that when I hit return, it automatically puts the number in before I've typed in a name. And this can look a little bit messy. If I wanted to stop there, if there was only 3 participants, I sort of have this number hanging over at the end. So we can modify this formula again. And all we need to do up here is after the column, if we just type in -1, hit enter, we're not going to get that. Okay, so it's going to work perfectly. Okay, so sequence can be combined with other functions like count A to make things like automated lists, or you can just use it to generate sequential numbers, which can be really helpful in itself. So those are the main sort of 6 dynamic array formulas that I wanted to speak to you about. Remember, those are the ones that are available in Excel for Microsoft 365, Excel 2019 and 2021. I am going to show you a couple more formulas, but these are the brand new ones, which have only been released in the last couple of months and are currently only available to Microsoft 365 users. But these are so awesome. I wanted to add them in at the end. And once these are a bit more prevalent and more people are using them, I'm going to do a webinar on all of these because I think there's 10 or 12 new functions that they've released in the last couple of months, and they're all pretty cool. But these are by far my favorite, and these are the ones that I think are the most useful out of the entire bunch. Now, what I'm going to show you are the functions text before, text after, and text split. And if you've ever had to clean data, if you've ever had to break up data across columns, there are numerous different methods that we can use to do this. So let's take a look at a couple of the older methods that we would use to break data up across columns. And again, we've just got a simple example. I have some full names just here. You might recognize some of these. And I want to split them into first name and last name. So there's many different ways we can do this. Probably the quickest and easiest is to use flash fill. So with flash fill, we just need to type in the first one and press Control E, and it's going to copy it down. Okay. If you weren't sure about that, let me do it again. We can type in the second one, Control E to copy down. That is by far the quickest way of breaking up these names in this example. Now, flash fill doesn't work in every single situation. It works in a situation like this because we have our columns next to each other. But if I had a blank column in between here, or maybe I wanted to output it somewhere else in the spreadsheet, flash fill isn't going to work. It only really works if the columns are right next to each other. Okay, so we need to know other methods for breaking up data. What else could we do here? Well, another really popular old school method is using text to columns. Everybody's favorite. We could select all of these, go up to the data tab, text to columns, and we can click on next and we can choose our delimiter. So where do we want to split these names? Well, we want to split them where we have a space. Okay. And then when we click on next, we can say, output it to this destination just here, and it's going to split up those names for us. So those are the methods that most people know when it comes to breaking up data across different columns. You might also use text functions, left, right, mid, in order to do this. But lots of these methods fall down when what you're trying to split up is slightly more complicated. This example is really easy. Most things can handle this. But what about if we have people or some of these students with a middle initial? You can see here we've got Brian P. Gosling, Emma K. Scone. But this isn't consistent. Not everybody has a middle initial. So when you have inconsistency, that's when it becomes a little bit more difficult to break up these names. And to do this, you wouldn't be able to use flash fill. That wouldn't work. Text to columns will also not work. The only method you could use here would be to use text functions, left, right, and mid. And those can get really, really complicated. And I feel like Microsoft have listened to everybody who is constantly saying to them, the left, right, and mid functions are too complicated. Nobody remembers them. They've listened and they've brought in these much simpler functions for splitting up text. So let me show you how awesome these are. Let's do the first name first of all. I'm going to use text before to do this. So the first argument of text before is simply the text that we want to break up, F6. All we then need to do is specify the delimiter. So we're saying output all of the text before the first space. So our delimiter is a space. Notice that the next arguments are all optional. We can define the instance number in the next step. Okay, so I want the first instance of the space. I want to extract everything before that first space. Now, one instance or the first instance is the default. So I don't need to give the instance number argument. I can simply do that. And it's going to extract that first name. Double click to copy down. Okay, nice and straightforward. What about the last name? Because last name was a little bit tricky to do when you're using the right function. Well, now we can use text after. Again, we can say text is F6. What is our delimiter? Well, again, we're going to use the space delimiter. But this time, we want to specify an instance number. But if we want to, effectively, we want to count back from the end of the last name. So if we want to count back, we can say -1. So this is basically going to find the first space from the right-hand side. So it goes backwards through your string. And check it out, nice and simple. Doing that using the right function is a lot more complicated. Now, what about the middle initial just here? How do we do this? Well, this is where we can combine text before and text after. Now, you can do this both ways. I'm going to go with text before, and then we're going to jump straight into text after. And what we're going to say here is we want our text, which is cell F3. We want our delimiter, which is a space. And then we're back into our text before. Again, we want to specify our space delimiter. And we're going to say -1. Have I got that the right way around? I'm not sure. I think I have. And let's double click to copy down. And you can see that it's picked up everyone who has a middle initial, but we also have some NA errors in here. Okay, so where it can't find a middle initial, we basically have NA. So what can we do with this? Well, we can combine it with the if NA function to remove these NA errors. So let's jump up to the formula bar. If NA on the front here. And then at the end, we just need to specify what we want to output into the cell if it finds an NA error. So I just want a space. So we're going to put that in quote marks, hit enter. And this time when we copy down, we just have the middle initial and we don't have any NA errors in there. Okay, so this, believe it or not, is much simpler than using left, right, and mid to extract text. And these are so flexible, you can use them in so many different types of situation. Final example that I'm going to show you before we finish up is the text split function. Because again, this is another awesome new function which allows us to deal with splitting up text that has multiple delimiters. So if we take a look at this first example, so where we have employees, I've got Claire, comma, space Lucy, comma, space Mark. So this is fairly straightforward. I could say text split. I just need to specify where the text is and then specify my delimiter. So my delimiter in this case is a comma space. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to separate those across based on that comma space. Now, if I was to try and copy this formula down, it doesn't work. Take a look at the second one. Why hasn't it worked? Well, it's because we have two different types of delimiter in here. So you can see we've got Harry, semicolon space, and then we have Max, colon, space. Okay. Now, the cool thing about the text split function is that it can handle multiple delimiters. So let's do this again. I'm just going to delete out all of this. Go for text split. Again, we just need to select our text. That's fine. But when it comes to the delimiters, if we have more than one, we need to put it inside curly brackets. Okay. So our first delimiter that we have in use here is comma space, and then we just specify our second delimiter, which is a semicolon space, and then we close the curly bracket and close off text split. That is all we need to do, and then when we copy this down, it's going to split those up correctly. So you can imagine the potential of this. If you've ever downloaded data or your data's in a right old mess, quite often you'll have multiple different types of delimiter in between different words, and you need to separate out all of that data. currently, or before these functions, that was a really difficult thing to do. But now that we have these new text manipulation functions, it makes it so simple. So that's just a sneak preview. If you don't have Microsoft 365, this is what Microsoft 365 users are enjoying currently. This is just a taster. There are literally 10 more functions like this available in Microsoft 365. Welcome to this month's webinar on the new dynamic array functions in Excel. So let's take a look at the agenda. So what we're going to cover today. So we're going to start out just talking a bit about what exactly are the new dynamic array functions. I'm going to introduce you to them, and then we're going to use them to do various different things. We're going to organize data into columns and rows. We're going to stack data arrays horizontally and vertically. We're going to see how we can wrap columns and rows, how we can specify columns to include or exclude. And we're going to be able to choose which columns and rows to extract. And finally, we have probably my favorite functions of the bunch. We have some text functions that are going to help us split up complex data. So these functions are really useful. And I've just sort of got a slide up here now that shows you the ones that we're going to cover today. Now, I've kind of divided them down into groups, and these functions are grouped. They kind of all fall under sort of text manipulation functions. Some of these would be considered array manipulation functions, and then we have functions which we use for what we call shaping. So shaping our data, manipulating it into the position that we need it to be into. So these are all reasonably similar, but they do different things. So we're going to go through each one of these. You can see that we have about 30, I think we've got 13 up on the slide here. There is one more that I haven't included. I'm going to talk more about that right at the end of the session. I haven't included it mainly because I think it's probably going to be the one that you're going to use the least, and it takes quite a while to explain. So I wasn't sure if we were going to have time. So I've decided that maybe you can go away and explore that one in your own time. We're going to do these ones that you see on the screen. So let's start out. We're going to come out of the presentation and let's go to our spreadsheet. So if you downloaded the spreadsheet, now is the time to load it back up again. And I'm going to do the same. And we're going to start out on the 2-col and 2-row worksheet at the bottom. Now, all of these examples I'm using, they're very basic examples. But hopefully they're simple enough so that you can illustrate, so that they illustrate the point and you can really understand what they're doing. So the first example here, example 1, what I've got here is just 4 columns, very small columns, webinar 1, webinar 2, 3, and 4. So maybe these are the people that attended webinars on each of these days. And if I just want to have a big long list of all of the attendees, I can use the 2-col function in order to do that. And this is the usage of this function in its most basic form. What it will do is it will basically combine data into one column. So if we type in equals, and we're going to go for 2-col. Let's press the tab key. Now, notice we have 3 arguments for the 2-col formula. Only the first one is mandatory. The others are optional because they're in those square brackets. So in its most basic form, the only thing we need to specify here is the array, which is basically the data that we want to combine into one column. Let's close the bracket, hit enter, and you can see there exactly what that does. So if you have your data split across different columns, then you can combine it all into one column using this function. So it can be really useful in many situations. Now, these functions, as I mentioned, these all have a common theme, and that is that they have this spill behavior. So what do we mean by that? Well, with dynamic array functions specifically, when we type them in, the output will spill down into however many cells it needs to accommodate the task. We're more used to when we're working with formulas, and if you take maybe something really simple like the sum formula, for example, when we type in a sum formula, the output of that, the result, is contained within one cell. And if we want to copy that to other cells, we can drag that fill handle down. These are a bit different in that they spill automatically down into the other cells. And a consequence of this is that if I was to click my mouse somewhere down here, you can see that the formula in the formula bar up here is actually grayed out. So with these dynamic array functions, you can only edit them in the cell that you originally typed them in. So I need to go up to cell G5 in order to be able to edit that. I can't edit it further down here. So dynamic arrays behave a little bit differently to regular formulas. Okay, so that is something to be aware of. So that is the most basic usage of to-call. Now, because of the way this formula is, we can combine it with other things to make it even more powerful. For example, if you take a look at the people that I have listed, we do have some duplicates. You can see that Deb attended webinar 1 and also webinar 2. Claire attended webinar 2 and webinar 3, and it's actually picked up those duplicates in the output just here. So you can see that we have Deb listed twice. We also have Claire listed twice. So what I could do here is combine to-call with unique in order to produce a unique list. So all we need to do is jump up to the formula bar and we can combine it with unique. Now, unique isn't one of the brand new dynamic array formulas, but it is reasonably new. It was released in the last sort of 18 months, and it's so good for removing duplicates. Now, we're just doing a basic unique. We don't need to, the only argument that we need is the array, which the to-call function is fulfilling. So we just need to add a bracket onto the end, hit enter, and now that list is unique. We only have Deb once, Claire once in that list. So you can probably see the potential that you have with some of these formulas in that you combine them with other things. If I wanted to go a stage further, maybe I want to sort this list as well. I could edit the formula again, and we could add sort on the front just here. And if I just want to do a very basic sort, a default sort, which will sort the items A to Z, we just need to add another bracket on the end, hit enter, and we now have that unique sorted list. So that is one of the uses of to-call and how you can combine it with other functions to make it even more powerful. Now, let's do this in a slightly different way, because this is all very well and good, but if you take a look at this data, it's all very consistent. We have 5 participants for each of the webinars. But as you know, life isn't always like that. If you take a look at example 2, we have inconsistent data. And what I mean by that is we have different numbers of people attending each webinar. So if we do this again on this data, let's go for to-call. The array, let's select all of this, close the bracket and hit enter. We get our list, but notice we get some zeros in here. So those zeros are appearing where it finds a blank cell in the data. And of course, this isn't ideal. It's not really what we want it to do. So what we can do is we can use one of the additional arguments of to-call to remove these zeros. So if we jump up to the formula bar and press comma, notice that the next argument is ignore. So what we can say here is ignore blanks. Also note that we have other things in there. If we had some errors, we could choose to ignore those as well, or we could ignore both. So I'm going to say ignore blanks. That is option number 1. And when we hit enter, it's going to remove all of those zeros out of the list. So that option is really handy if you have inconsistent data and you still want to use this function. Okay, so that is the to-call function, I should say. A couple of ways that you can use that. And as you might imagine, to-row is pretty much exactly the same. It works exactly the same, except instead of combining everything vertically down the page, it's going to combine everything horizontally. So I'll just show you very quickly, because once you know one, you pretty much know the other. Let's do to-row. The arguments are exactly the same. So let's use this example. This is the array. Close the bracket, hit enter, and you can see it's just going to combine them in a big, long, horizontal list. Okay, so that is to-call and to-row. Let's move on to the next example. So we're now working on the VStack and HStack worksheet. And again, these are 2 more of the dynamic array functions. So let's start out with example 1. Now, we just looked at two-col, which allows us to combine data from multiple columns into one column. But the drawback of two-col is that it only allows us to select one array. Now, VStack is very similar. We can use it to combine data into one column, but we can select multiple arrays from anywhere. So your arrays could be on the same worksheet. They might be on a completely different worksheet. It doesn't matter. We can select as many arrays as we like and combine them all together using VStack. So let's take a look at what we have here, the data. We have some countries listed just here, and we just have some sales values for those countries. And then next to that, we have another list of countries and some more sales values. And maybe I've been tasked with just combining all of this together and having all of the countries listed and all of the sales in one big long list. Maybe my boss wants to do some calculations or some formulas. It's going to be a lot easier if I change the layout of my data. So for this, I can use VStack. Now notice here the arguments: array 1, array 2, array 3. This is all we need to do. We just need to select the arrays that we want to stack on top of each other. So the first one, A5 to B11, comma, and then the second one. If you had an array that was on another worksheet that you wanted to include, you would simply do the same thing. You just click on the worksheet and select the array, and it would pick it up. Close the bracket, hit enter, and once again, you've got all of your data stacked on top of each other. So really nice and straightforward. You can come across some issues with this, with zeros and things like that. But what I say to people is tables are your best friend. For example, data doesn't always stay the same. It might be that next month I need to add some more countries onto the bottom here. The best way to do that is to put your data into tables before you construct your VStack formula. So let's do this again, but this time we'll use tables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this little data here, Control T. My table has headers. Let's click on OK to put that into an Excel table. Now remember, with Excel tables, these are one of the best things in Excel because they have auto expand capabilities. So what that means is if I was to add some more data onto the bottom, it's automatically going to expand to accommodate that new data, and all of my formulas will update automatically. So let's go up to the table design ribbon. In the first group just here, the properties, currently the table name is just table 1. Now you can rename these just to make them a little bit more meaningful. In this example, I'm not going to. Let's just select the second one, Control T, to put that into a table as well. And this one is called table 2. So we have table 1 and table 2. So now if I was constructing my VStack, it's going to be better for me to use my table arrays rather than actual physical cells. Okay, so my first array, I'm going to select table 1. My second array is going to be table 2. Now I'm going to get exactly the same result, but the advantage here is that if something gets added onto the bottom, so let's just say Peru, 500, it automatically updates. Okay, and you can see now I can go down here and maybe add Argentina, and let's add 200 in there, like so. Okay, so my advice, always put your data into tables because it means you can have inconsistent lengths of data and everything should update correctly. Okay, so that is the VStack formula. And as you can imagine, H stack stands for horizontal stack. That's basically what we're doing here: vertical stack, horizontal stack. H stack works exactly the same way, except we're going horizontally across the page. So just to show you a quick example, again, I have 4 little tables just here. I could put these into Excel tables. For this example, I'm not going to bother just for time's sake. But we have country sales, and then we have some more countries over here, here, and here. Now I could combine all of these horizontally using HStack. So if we go down here, let's type in HStack. And once again, we just need to select our arrays. So this is our first array, comma, this is our second, comma, this is the third, and this is the fourth.
close the bracket, hit enter, and we've now rearranged our data into a completely different layout. Okay, with all of these that I'm showing you as well, for example, this H stack or even this V stack, you can of course add in things like sorting options. You might want to add filter options into here as well. And I am going to show you an example a bit later on as to how you can combine some of these dynamic arrays with the filter formula also. Okay, so really nice and straightforward. Let's move on to the next example. So in this example, we are looking at wrap cols and wrap rows. Again, these are text manipulation functions. Now, I would say that wrap cols is going to be the one that you're probably going to use way more than wrap rows, but let's take a look at both of them. Excuse me. So at the top here, in this example 1 for wrap rows, we have our data in a bit of a strange layout. And this is the reason why I say that you might not use this as often, because this is a very strange way to have your data laid out. But we have 4 employees and we have the employee names, and then we have the department that these employees basically belong to. So what I want to do is I want to wrap this around. I want each of these, the departments, to appear underneath each of the employees. So we could do this using wrap rows. So if I type in, let's say, wrap rows, again, we have 3 arguments just here. The last one is optional. And I am going to show you an example when we do wrap cols of that 3rd optional argument. For this first example, we're just going to use the first 2 arguments, so vector and wrap count. Now, vector is just another way for, another word for array or range. This is the data that we want to wrap. So I want to wrap all of this data just here. We then need to specify the wrap count. So this is basically like a page break almost. Where do we want to break and then wrap around? So if I take a look at my data, I want it to break after employee 4, and I want all of the departments on the next row. So our wrap count is going to be 4. Close the bracket, hit enter, and that's exactly what we get. I'm sure you can imagine how this would work if you had a much larger data set. So that is how you can use wrap rows. As I said, I think that one is probably going to be the one that you use less often than wrap cols. So let's move on to taking a look at that. Now with wrap cols, I've just got sort of a random list of 12 products listed out here. So what I could do with wrap cols is I could say, oops, wrap cols. Again, we have the same 3 arguments. So what I could do here is the vector is going to be what I want to wrap, which is all of my data, and then I can choose the wrap count. So maybe I want these products to be wrapped around in 3 rows. I could type in 3, close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to reorganize my data. Okay, so now I have 3 rows of 4 products. If we click back in the first cell and change the wrap count in the formula bar, we could change that to 4 instead. And now we're getting 4 rows of 3 products each. What about if I change this to wrap count 5? What do you think is going to happen here? Because now we have 5 rows, but notice we have some NAs in here because we only have 12 products. So effectively, the last 3 cells are blank, which is why we have that NA. Now we could go about dealing with this NA. I apologize, there's a siren going past. Hopefully it's not too loud. Now, we could go about dealing with this NA in a couple of different ways, and you might already be familiar with the error checking formula if NA. You could definitely use that. So if I wanted to get rid of these NAs, I could go up to my formula and I could use if NA. Now, if you're not familiar with if NA, what it basically does is it will look in your range of cells for anywhere that has an NA error. And you can see that we have 3 of them. And once it finds them, we can specify what we want to replace the NA error width. So it could be a piece of text that's a little bit more meaningful than simply NA. So if we add if NA onto the front, the actual value is being generated by this formula. We just need to specify what we want it to show if the value is NA. So maybe I just want a blank. I could just put 2 quote marks in there, close it off, hit enter, and that's going to get rid of those NA. So it looks a bit neater. Now, you could do it that way. And if you're used to using if NA, you might find that method a little bit easier. But we don't have to do it that way because we have an argument in wrap calls that will do this for us. So if we go to the end here, that's what this pad with final optional argument is for. So if I press comma, what I could do is I could add my space in there instead. It's going to stay the same because we already removed that using if NA. But if I wanted a piece of text to show instead of an empty cell, I could say no product. I could put anything I like in there in between quote marks, and we're going to get that instead. Okay, so you don't need to use if NA with wrap calls. You can simply use that final pad with argument. All right. So that is kind of how wrap rows and wrap calls work. You're probably seeing by now that these are very similar formulas for manipulating text. And as I said, can be really useful when you're trying to do a multitude of different things when you're working in Excel. Let's move on to take and drop, which sounds very, very dramatic. Now, these two are basically opposites of one another. Take and drop will allow us to keep or drop parts of the data that we don't want. So let's start out with the take formula. Notice here I have a small data set that's showing some order numbers, it's showing some customer names, and it's showing the amount that they've spent on that order. So what I could do here is I could say take, and I could specify the rows that I want to take from this data set. Now again, we have 3 arguments. The last one is optional. The first argument is the array. So this is basically what you want to return. Now I want to return all of the information, so I'm going to select the entire array. And we can then choose how many rows of data we want to take. So maybe I want the top 4 rows from this data set. I could specify 4, close the bracket, hit enter, and that's exactly what I'm going to get. It's going to extract the top 4 rows. What about if I wanted to extract just the bottom 4 rows? Well, if we go up to the formula bar, instead of putting 4 up there, we can add -4, and it will work from the bottom. So when I hit enter, I now have the bottom 4 rows. What about if I only want to take 2 columns? So maybe I still want the bottom 4 rows, but maybe I'm only interested in the order number column and the customer column. I'm not interested in the amount. Well, what I could do here is modify the formula again, and this is where that third optional argument comes into play. So I could say comma, and I only want the first 2 rows, sorry, first 2 columns. Hit enter, and that's exactly what I'm going to get. So you have a multitude of different options and things you can add in here in order to take different pieces of data from within your data set. Again, we could choose to sort these as well. So let's give ourselves a bit of a longer list. I'm going to take, let's take the top 7 rows, like so. If I wanted to sort these, I could sort them by whichever column I want, simply by using the sort function. So if we go up and edit the formula, I could add sort in the front here. The array is being generated by the take formula. So all we need to do is provide the sort index. And the sort index is basically the column that we want to sort by. So for example, if I wanted to sort by the amount column in ascending order, the sort index would be the column number. So the amount column is column number 3. And then I could specify the sort order, ascending or descending. So let's go for ascending. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to sort those. Okay. So lots of different things that you can do with these functions. Now, as you would expect, the drop function basically allows us to do something very similar, but it's the opposite. We're choosing which rows we want to drop, which rows we don't want. So maybe I want to drop the first 10 rows. I could say drop. We have exactly the same arguments. I can select my array, and I want to drop the first 10 rows, like so. So you can see what it's done now. The first one that I'm getting here in my results is order number 11 because it's basically excluded the first 10 records. I've dropped those records. Okay. And again, you could do the same. You could put a minus in front, all different kinds of things to drop the last 10, so on and so forth. Okay, so the two functions pretty much work in exactly the same way. You have that final column argument as well. So if you want to drop various different columns, you can drop the third column, the second column, whatever you want to drop, you can. Okay, so again, can be really useful, particularly when you combine them with other columns. That's particularly useful if you have a very large data set and you just want to extract certain records out of that data. Now, working along the same lines, the next set of functions that we have are choose cols and choose rows. And this is where you can get a bit more specific about the data that you want to pick out of a data set. With take and drop, you're kind of doing that in blocks. You know, you can only specify that you want to take the first 5 rows. You can't say, okay, I want row number 1, 3, and 5. But with choose cols and choose rows, that's exactly what you can do. So you can essentially select or extract non-contiguous ranges that aren't next to each other using these functions. Again, it can be super useful. So let's start out really basic. We're going to use the choose cols function. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say choose cols. Again, our first argument is the array. So we're going to select everything because I want to return everything. And then we can choose the column that we're interested in. So maybe I'm only interested in seeing the first column. Close the bracket, hit enter. That's all I'm going to get. If I only wanted the second column, I could change that to column 2, and I'm going to get the customer names. If I want columns 1 and 2, I could specify that as well. So I could say 1, 2, and it's going to give me both of them. All right. If I just wanted the amount, if I just wanted the amount, I could just choose column 3. Okay, so you can pick exactly the columns that you want. Now, the way that I prefer to use this is I like to use the choose rows function instead, because I find that's really useful, because that is where you can actually pick which rows you're interested in out of your data set. Now, before we get on to that, I've just forgotten about one example that I do want to show you is how we can use choose cols with the filter function as well. So let's say, for example, we want to return all of the customers and the amounts, but only when the amount is over $150. So what we could do here is combine choose cols with the filter function. So let's go for choose cols again. And we're going to go straight into filter. Now, if filter is one of those functions that you've never used, I highly recommend that you go away and have a little research on this, because this function is probably one of the most useful functions that have been released in the last couple of years by Microsoft. It's such a flexible function, and it means that we can filter data wherever we are in our workbook, and we can also combine it with other formulas and functions like we're doing here. So we're working within our filter function. Now, what we need to say with this is the first argument is the array. Now, I want to return the order number, the customer, and the amount. So we want to make sure we select the entire array. Then what we need to do is we basically need to tell the filter function what we want to include. So what is our filter criteria is basically what you're including. So I only want to return records where the amount is greater than or equal to $150. So I want to say include when this column is greater than or equal to 150. Let's close the bracket to close off our filter function, and we're now back into our choose cols. So it's going to perform that filter and extract those records, and now we get to tell it the columns that we're interested in. So maybe I'm only interested in the customer and the amount column. So I could say, okay, once you've run the filter, just return columns 2 and 3. Close the bracket, hit enter. And that's exactly what we get. So we have a filter in action here, and we've specified the exact columns that we want to return. Okay, so this is just another example. It's a bit more of an advanced example, but it's just another thing. So you can sort of see the power and the potential of some of these functions when you combine them with other things. Okay, so that's choose cols. Let's now circle back around to choose rows. As I said, this is probably my favorite out of the two. So choose rows, again, the arguments are extremely similar, and that's what's awesome about these, is that if you know one of them, you pretty much know the other one as well. So we're going to choose rows. The array, well, this is the array. Again, we want to return, or we want to look in our entire data set. And then we can just specify what rows we want to return. So maybe I want to return row 1, row 3, and row 10. I can just type those in like that, close the bracket, hit enter, and those are the rows that I've got. You can see row 1, row 3, and row 10. All right, so really powerful. Of course, we can then combine that with a sort. We could filter it. We could, in some cases, we might want to create a unique list. There's all different kinds of things that we can do with these dynamic arrays. Okay, so this is great for cherry picking rows out of a data set. Fabulous. Let's move along. Now, the last lot of functions, so we're actually going to finish on time today, which is actually amazing. The last lot of functions are actually my favorite set of functions. I can't tell you how happy I was when I saw that these were included in these new dynamic function releases. And I tell you why. If you ever have to clean up data, split data across columns, and you're used to using things like the left function, the right function, the mid function, you probably know that those can get very complicated very quickly. Left, right, and mid are really useful, and they're really easy if you have consistent data. So if every record looks pretty much the same with the same layout, much like these full names that we have here, then you can use left, right, and mid fairly easily. If anything is even slightly inconsistent, left, right, and mid become a bit of a nightmare to use. So I was so happy when I saw all of the hassle taken out of this with the text before, text after, and text split functions. And I'm really excited to show these to you because I think these are absolutely awesome. So let's take a look at a few examples. So we're going to start basic again. We have a list of full names just here. Now, these are very basic full names. There is nothing extraordinary or different about them. They're all pretty consistent. We have a first name and we have a last name. And all I want to do is break these up into different columns. Now, of course, you don't have to use functions to do something simple like this. You could use text to columns. You could use flash fill. But those methods don't work in every single scenario, whereas text functions will always work. So it's good to know these as well. So let's deal with the first name. I want to split the first name out of this cell. So how can we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to look at what is consistent amongst all of these names. And what is consistent is that there is a space in between the first and the last name. So what we can essentially do is we can say to Excel, we can use text before and say extract everything, all of the text before the space. Let's do it. I'm going to go text before. All we need to specify here is the text, which is cell A6. And then we get to choose the delimiter. So the delimiter is just the space that's in between. That is it. So we're saying extract all of the text before the first space. Hit enter, and then we can double click to copy this down. So nice and straightforward. Much, much simpler than some of the older text functions. Now, what about the last name? How are we going to do that? Well, we could use text after to do this. So let's go for equals text after. Again, there's the text. We want to extract all of the text after the space. And that's going to give us the last name. Double click to copy down. How cool is that? So simple. Text before and text after. Just specify the delimiter. So that's the first example. As I said, this is consistent data. So let's take a look at how we would use these if our data isn't so consistent. So if you cast your eyes across to example number 2, notice that we have in column E, we have full names. These are the same names, but I've made some changes. So you can see here, the first one, we now have a middle name for Dale. So we have Dale James Warren. We have Anne Marie Crawford, and we have Saul Hamish McDonald. The rest of these people still just have a first name and last name. So this data is no longer consistent because for some of these we have 2 spaces, and for some of these we have 1. Now, to extract the first name from this type of data, it's exactly the same. We can still use text before. To do that, we can say this is the text, and we want to extract everything before the first space delimiter. So we just need to specify that delimiter. No problem, exactly the same as what we did previously. The more complex issue comes when we try to extract just the middle name and then the last name because we have inconsistencies, okay? For example, I can't say to Excel, extract all of the text before the second delimiter because it's going to extract Dale James and not just James. I can't say to Excel, extract all of the text after the first delimiter because it will extract James Warren as opposed to just James. So in order to be able to grab a middle name, you need to use both text after and text before. So if we go equals, we're going to say text after, and then we're going to go straight into text before. So the first thing we need to supply is the text. Now, currently, we're working in the text before function, okay? So the delimiter. Well, if I look at Dale James Warren, I want to extract the text before the second space delimiter, okay? So the delimiter is space. This time we want to add in the additional argument of the instance number. This is where we can specify which instance of space we're doing this for. So I want to extract everything before the second space delimiter. So the instance number there is 2. Let's close off text before. Now, if I was just to leave the formula as it is, it's going to extract everything before that second delimiter. So currently it would extract Dale James. Okay, so now we're back into our text after. Okay, so now we can specify the delimiter of space, and that is pretty much it because we're saying extract all of the text after the first space. So the combination of these two, when we close this off, it's going to extract exactly what we need. If we double click to copy down, you'll notice that where we do have a middle name, that is our result. Otherwise, we have an NA in here. Now, with these NA errors, these are dealt with in exactly the same way as previously. You could use if NA to get rid of these, or alternatively, one of the arguments of text before will allow us to deal with these NA errors. So if we click back up in our text before formula, notice that the last argument is if not found. Okay, so we need to get to that argument. So we're going to press comma, which is going to move us to match mode, comma again, which will move us to match end, comma again, if not found. Okay, so now we can specify a space in here. And when we copy this down, it's going to replace all of those NAs with effectively a blank. So it looks a lot neater and a lot tidier. All right. Now, if this is the first time that you're seeing these, this probably looks quite complicated. And I will say it is a little bit difficult to get your head around, first of all. It really is just practice. But once you've got it down, it is so much quicker than some of the old methods that we used to use. So I definitely do advise that you practice this. Final thing to do here is to extract the last name. Now, again, we need to do something a little bit different here. We're going to say text after. This is our text. But all we need to do here is we need to specify our delimiter, which is a space. We want to work from backwards forward. So with text after, if we put -1 here, it's going to work from the right-hand side of the cell. So this is basically looking for the first space from the right-hand side of the cell, which for us would be just before the word Warren, which is exactly what we want because we're extracting everything after that. Close the bracket, hit enter, and we're going to get our last name. Double click to copy down. All right. I think these are absolutely awesome and so much easier once you get used to them. The final function that I want to show you, and this is probably my favorite out of all of these, is very similar to these. This is called the text split function. And let me just delete that data out. Now, text split, again, allows us to split up text across different columns. But again, it makes it so much easier. And the awesome thing about this text split function is that it allows us to have different types of delimiter. That has always been a sticking point with things like text to columns. If you have a data set, and this can happen, particularly if you've downloaded data set from if you've downloaded a data set from an external system and it comes across looking a little bit of a mess, you might have your columns separated with different types of delimiter. You might have a comma separating some things. You might have a space separating others. And that's quite hard to deal with, again, because it's not consistent if you need to split everything up into nice, neat columns. So you can see here, this is a very small example, and I'm going to scroll in a little bit so you can see this a bit clearer. You can see here we have some staff. I've just got 3 names. Now, the first one, Dale, Mark, Sue, each name is separated with a comma and a space. The next one, we have something different. The names are separated with a semicolon space. And the third one, we're using 2 different delimiters. We have a semicolon space and a comma space. So if we use the text split function, notice we have very similar arguments to text before and text after. So we can specify the text that we want to split up, cell A26, and then we can specify the delimiter. So for us in this example, our delimiter is a comma space. So in quote marks, we want comma space. Close the bracket, hit enter, and that's going to do exactly what I want it to do. It's going to split those names up wherever it finds comma space. So for the first row, because it's consistent, it works. If I copy this formula down, it doesn't work because we have different delimiters in use in these other 2 examples. So let's do this again, but we're going to do something that I think is pretty cool, because we can specify multiple delimiters. And there is a little trick to it, so I will show you. Text split. So we want to split up our text. Now, our column delimiters. We have in use in this data set 2 different delimiters, comma space and semicolon space. If you have more than one delimiter, you can specify those by putting them inside curly brackets in the formula. So I've opened a curly bracket. Our first delimiter is comma space. So that needs to go in quote marks, comma space, close quotes. The second delimiter in use is a semicolon space. So we need a comma in here again, and we can then specify the second one. Semicolon space, close the quote marks, and then we can close the bracket. So if you have multiple delimiters, put them inside those curly brackets. All we need to do is close off the text split formula. It looks good for the first one, but what about for the other 2? Let's copy down, check it out. It looks amazing. Now, I only used 2 different delimiters there in my example, but if you had data that had 5, 10 different delimiters, you could put them all inside these curly brackets, these curly braces, and you would be able to use those to split up your data. Okay. Now, of course, there are so many other uses for all of the functions and formulas that I've shown you today. It is quite a lot to take in because there is a lot of them. I'm hoping that for the most part, most of these are pretty straightforward to use. And hopefully you're sort of getting an idea and thinking about your own work as to how you might incorporate these, how you might use them, and how they might be useful to you.
Thank you so much for joining. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all learn at least one thing that you think is going to help you. Have a great night, a great afternoon, a great morning, wherever you are, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Says It.